Welcome to Dark Verse, the realm where the forgotten whispers of the past intertwine with the chilling events of the present. I'm your host, Isaac Nightshade, your guide through the unsettling and unexplained, delving into the very heart of terror. Tonight, I'm about to lead you into the depths of fear with 8 true sleepover horror stories. These are not just tales to entertain you, they are real-life experiences that will make you question the safety of your own home, your own friends, and the very idea of a peaceful night's sleep. From terrifying encounters with strangers in the dark to nightmarish events that no one could have foreseen, these stories are filled with the kind of horror that can only happen when you least expect it. So, turn off the lights, get comfortable, and prepare to step into the unknown. If you find yourself captivated by the strange and the terrifying, be sure to subscribe and join me in the Dark Verse. This journey into the darkness is about to begin. Story 1. The Uninvited Guest. It was supposed to be just another sleepover. Sarah and her 4 friends had gathered at Emily's house, a massive, creaky farmhouse that sat on the outskirts of town. Emily's family had lived there for generations, and while the house had its charm, it also had an eerie vibe. The creaking wooden floors, the dust-laden windows, and the dimly lit hallways gave the house an unsettling feel, especially at night. But Emily assured them that it was fine. The house was old. Yes, but it was perfectly safe. Nothing ever happened there. That night, Sarah and her friends huddled together in Emily's spacious living room. The sound of their laughter and chatter filled the room as they tried to stay awake with snacks and scary movies. Around midnight, they decided to play a game of hide and seek. The rules were simple. One person hides, the others seek. But this time, Emily's suggestion to make it a little more thrilling had added a darker twist. They had to stay inside. The house and the seeker had to be blindfolded. The game quickly took a sinister turn. Sarah was the first to hide. She chose to crouch behind an old wardrobe in the corner of the living room. The air felt cold, and the house seemed to be growing quieter by the second. Emily began counting, but Sarah's sense of unease grew as she waited in the darkness. She could hear the others laughing and chatting in the background, but something about the stillness in the house unnerved her. When Emily finally yelled, "Ready or not, here I come," Sarah felt a cold breeze pass over her. It sent a shiver down her spine, but she figured it was just the old house. Still, something didn't feel right. Minutes passed, and the other girls were still searching the house, but Sarah remained hidden. As she squatted behind the wardrobe, her thoughts wandered to strange noises she'd heard earlier, whispers in the walls, the floorboards creaking under an invisible weight. Sarah dismissed the thoughts as just her imagination running wild, but as the silence stretched on, her discomfort deepened. Then she heard something that made her blood run cold. Footsteps. The steps were soft at first, almost inaudible, but they grew louder. Sarah felt her heart race as the footsteps grew nearer and nearer. They were slow, deliberate, like someone was walking directly toward her. She didn't dare move, her eyes wide with terror. She pressed herself further into the corner, hoping the footsteps wouldn't notice. Her! The sound stopped. Silence. Seconds passed and Sarah felt her breath catch in her throat. She listened intently, but there was no movement, no sound. She counted the seconds. Then suddenly a voice broke the silence. A low, cold whisper. "You're not alone." Sarah's blood froze. It wasn't one of the girls. She could tell the voice was male, deep and gravelly. Her mind raced, her pulse pounding in her ears. Who was in the house? Before she could move, the door to the living room creaked open and Emily's voice called out, "Sarah, are you hiding in there?" With relief flooding her, Sarah scrambled out from behind the wardrobe. The girls had been looking for her for far too long. But as she stood up, she noticed something strange. The front door, which had been locked before, was now wide open. A chill ran through her body. No one had been near the door all night. Emily, the door. It's open," Sarah said, her voice trembling. Emily walked over to the door and glanced. Outside, but the night was pitch dark. There was no one in sight. "Maybe the wind blew it open," Emily said with a nervous laugh. though her voice lacked conviction. Sarah wasn't so sure. Something about the entire situation felt off. She tried to shake it off, but the unease lingered, gnawing at her. When they went to bed later that night, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still in the house, watching them. As the others drifted off to sleep, Sarah lay awake, her mind racing. Was it possible someone had broken in? She couldn't understand why none of the others had heard the footsteps. She decided to get up and check the house one last time, just to be sure. Moving quietly down the hall, Sarah made her way to the living room. Everything was still and dark, the only sound the wind rattling the windows. She checked the locks on the door. Everything was secure. But when she walked past the wardrobe, she stopped dead in her tracks. The door to the attic, which was usually locked, was wide open. Her breath caught in her throat as she took a step back, her heart hammering in her chest. She hadn't heard the attic door creak open. No one had even mentioned going up there. As she stood frozen in fear, the silence was broken once again. A soft, distant voice echoed from above. "Come upstairs." Sarah's blood ran cold. She didn't wait to hear more. She rushed back to the others, heart pounding in her chest. She didn't tell them what she had heard, knowing they would never believe her. But all night, Sarah couldn't sleep. The image of that open attic door and the voice that had whispered to her haunted her. The next morning, Emily asked Sarah if she'd seen anything strange the night before. Sarah hesitated before nodding. Emily looked at her with a strange expression on her face. "You're not the first person to hear strange things in this house," Emily said softly. "My mom says it's haunted, but no one talks about it. There's something upstairs. Something that shouldn't be there." Sarah's heart sank. She had felt it the night before. That eerie presence. The footsteps. The whispers. The girls left the farmhouse later that day, but the memory of that night stayed with Sarah. She never returned to Emily's house again, and she never spoke to Emily about what happened. But sometimes when Sarah was alone, she could still hear those whispers in the dark. Come upstairs. Story 2. The Silent Roommate. It was the beginning of Megan's sophomore year at the University of Florida. She had always looked forward to living in a dormitory with a roommate, thinking it would be the ideal setup for college life. After her first year of living off campus, she decided it would be easier to move back on campus, meet new people, and be closer to her classes. She had been assigned a roommate named Kelly, who, from the brief email exchange they had, seemed pretty normal. Quiet, maybe, but it was hard to gauge someone from a few typed words. When Megan arrived at her dorm, she was excited, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was a little off about Kelly. The room was small, the walls thin, but it was private enough for the two of them to share. Megan quickly realized that Kelly was shy, keeping to herself mostly, and rarely engaging in conversation. She'd spent days and nights by herself in their room, reading, listening to music, or simply studying. Megan didn't mind at first. She was used to having her own space, but as time went on, she began to notice things about Kelly that were a bit strange. Kelly didn't talk much. In fact, she hardly spoke at all. Even when Megan tried to start a conversation, Kelly would only respond with short, monotone answers. But what truly unsettled Megan was how Kelly never left the room. In the mornings, Kelly would get up, get dressed, and then sit back down on her bed. She would stay there for hours, never leaving the dorm. Megan tried to give her the benefit of the doubt, thinking that maybe Kelly was just introverted and wanted to focus on her studies. But things started getting eerie. One night, as Megan was heading to bed, she noticed Kelly sitting in the corner of the room, facing the wall. The lights were off, but the moonlight filtered in through the blinds, casting an eerie glow on the room. Kelly was just sitting there, unmoving. At first, Megan thought she might be reading or on her phone. But as she got closer, she realized Kelly wasn't doing anything at all. She was simply staring at the wall, unblinking, not moving. "Kelly, are you okay?" Megan asked, a little unsure of how to approach the situation. Kelly didn't respond. Her eyes didn't even seem to acknowledge Megan's presence. She just kept staring at the wall, her body stiff and unyielding. Megan didn't know what to do. Was Kelly sick? Was she depressed? But the silence was deafening, and the stillness was unnerving. She didn't want to disturb her further, so she quietly went to bed But sleep didn't come easy that night. Over the next few days, things only grew worse. Kelly's behavior became more peculiar. She began to whisper to herself, soft, unintelligible words in the middle of the night. Megan couldn't make out what she was saying, but it was unsettling nonetheless. Sometimes Kelly would just sit on her bed, staring at the ceiling for hours, completely still. When Megan would get up to use the bathroom, Kelly would be watching her, her gaze piercing through the darkness. But the worst incident happened one evening when Megan returned from class. She had just opened the door to their room when she was hit with an overwhelming feeling of dread. Kelly was sitting on the floor, her back against the wall, staring at nothing. There was an empty, blank look in her eyes. Megan walked closer, calling her name gently. "Kelly, what's going on? Are you all right?" Kelly didn't answer. Instead, she suddenly snapped her head toward Megan with a cold, unsettling smile. "I'm just thinking," Kelly said in a low, emotionless voice. Her eyes, wide and hollow, seemed almost vacant. "I'm always thinking, Megan. Always." Megan stepped back instinctively. Something about Kelly's eyes, her tone, and her presence felt completely wrong. It was as if her roommate had disappeared, replaced by something else, something darker. Megan could feel a cold sweat creeping up her back. "Okay, well, I'm going to go take a shower." She quickly gathered her things and left the room, locking the doctor behind her. As she stepped into the hallway, she tried to shake off the eerie feeling that had taken hold of her. But it wasn't easy. Her heart was pounding in her chest, and her mind raced with questions she didn't want to answer. That night, as Megan tried to fall asleep, she couldn't stop thinking about Kelly. She wanted to reach out to someone, but who would believe her? A girl who just sat still for hours, whispered to herself, and smiled like a puppet? She didn't even know what to make of it. The next day, Megan decided to get some help. She reached out to a counselor at the campus mental health center, explaining her concerns about Kelly. The counselor listened intently and assured Megan that it was normal for people to go through phases, but there were clear signs that Kelly might need more help than just a counseling session. But before anything could be done, something happened that left Megan even more shaken. That evening, when she returned to the dorm after class, Kelly was gone. Megan didn't know where she had gone or when she left. Her bed was neatly made, her belongings all packed away, and there was a note on the desk. It simply read, "I'm sorry, Megan. I can't stay here anymore. I need to go." Megan didn't know how to react. She felt a strange mix of relief and confusion, but the thought of Kelly leaving, just like that, unsettled her even more. She went to the counselor's office the next day to report what happened, but when she asked about Kelly's whereabouts, the counselor told her that Kelly had left the campus. No one knew why or where she went. For weeks, Megan couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right with Kelly, and no one could explain it. It was as if Kelly had disappeared into thin air, leaving behind only memories of an unsettling, silent presence. To this day, Megan sometimes wonders what happened to Kelly. Was she truly sick, or had something darker been lurking within her all along? Story 3. The Lurking Shadow. Jake had always been the adventurous type. A lover of history and the unexplained, he would often explore abandoned places with his friends, seeking out hidden gems that others had forgotten. It was during one of these weekends that Jake found himself traveling upstate to a small town that he had never heard of before, called Westbrook. The town was known for its picturesque views, quiet streets, and the hauntingly beautiful mill house that had been abandoned for decades. It was rumored that the house was haunted, but Jake wasn't the kind to believe in ghost stories. He thought the place was just a relic of history waiting to be explored. When Jake arrived in Westbrook, it was late afternoon. The air was crisp, the kind of chill that hinted at the coming winter. The sun had just begun to set, casting a warm golden hue over the town. He checked into a small inn, where the owner, a woman named Martha, gave him a wary look when he mentioned the mill house. "You plan to go there?" she asked, her voice tinged with concern. Jake laughed it off, thinking she was just being protective. "Yeah, I've heard it's haunted, but it's just an old house, right? What's the worst that could happen?" Martha didn't respond immediately. She simply gave him a small, knowing smile and warned, "The house has its secrets, young man. Be careful." Jake shrugged off her warning and made his way to the mill house that evening, arriving just as darkness descended over the town. The house was as impressive as it was eerie. With its towering, rotting structure and broken windows, it stood as a monument to the past. Jake felt a sense of excitement, coupled with a hint of nervousness, as he stepped onto the property. The first thing he noticed was how quiet the area was. The town's bustle seemed miles away, and there was an almost unnatural stillness surrounding the house. He stepped inside through the front door, which creaked ominously on its hinges. The smell of damp wood and mildew immediately hit him, but it didn't deter him. He had a flashlight and his camera with him, eager to document his adventure. As Jake explored the first floor, he marveled at the old wooden beams and decaying furniture. The floors groaned under his weight, but everything was still intact. There was nothing overtly sinister about the house, yet there was something off. An odd sensation prickled at the back of his neck, as if he were being watched. But when he turned around, no one was there. He continued his exploration, moving to the second floor. The stairs creaked with every step, and the flashlight flickered slightly, but Jake didn't let it bother him. He was used to these kinds of places. He entered a large bedroom on the second floor, where an old faded mirror hung on the wall. As he examined it, something strange caught his eye. An image of a shadow darting across the reflection. Jake froze, blinking several times to make sure he wasn't imagining it. But the shadow was gone as quickly as it had appeared. Shaking his head, he chalked it up to exhaustion. Maybe he was just tired from the long drive. He decided to call it a night and made his way back to the stairs. But as he descended, he heard a soft sound, a whisper. He stopped dead in his tracks. The whisper came again, but this time it was louder. It was almost like a voice calling out to him, but no one was there. Jake's heart started to race. The house was definitely unsettling, but there was no logical explanation for what he was experiencing. He gripped his flashlight tightly, feeling the sweat begin to beat on his forehead. "Hello?" he called out, his voice shaking. There was no answer, just the deafening silence. He shook off his unease and decided to leave. The day's exploration had been enough for now, and the last thing he wanted was to overstay his welcome in what was beginning to feel like an unnerving place. But as he reached the front door, something made him stop. His flashlight caught a glimpse of movement out of the corner of his eye. A shadow, tall and thin, stood motionless at the end of the hallway, just beyond the doorway to the kitchen. Jake's breath caught in his throat. He tried to rationalize it. It was just the light. Maybe a trick of the shadows. But as he stared harder, the figure seemed to grow more defined, taking the shape of a person, its features obscured by the darkness. The figure didn't move. It simply stood there, as if waiting. Jake's instincts screamed at him to run, but his feet felt like they were glued to the floor. His heart pounded loudly in his chest, and a cold chill ran down his spine. The air felt colder now, too. Without thinking, Jake took a step forward, calling out, "Who's there?" His voice echoed in the empty house. The shadow didn't respond. Instead, it began to slowly move toward him, its presence growing more intense with each step. Jake's flashlight flickered once more, before going out completely. The room plunged into darkness, and the whispering began again. This time it was clear, just one word repeated over and over. "Leave!" Jake felt his stomach turn, and panic surged through him. He stumbled back toward the door, his hands shaking as he fumbled with the handle. It was locked. The whispering grew louder. "Leave! Leave! Leave!" It echoed through the house, filling his mind with dread. Desperate, Jake finally wrenched the door open, bursting out into the cold night air. He didn't stop to look back, his legs moving, faster than they ever had before. He ran all the way back to the inn, not daring to glance behind him until he reached the safety of the small, warm lobby. Out of breath, he collapsed onto a chair, his body drenched in sweat. The innkeeper, Martha, looked at him with an expression of quiet understanding. "You saw it, didn't you?" she asked softly. Jake nodded, still shaking. He had no words for what he'd experienced, but Martha seemed to know exactly what he meant. She didn't ask for more details. That house has a way of calling to people, she said. You're lucky you made it out. Jake stayed up for the rest of the night, terrified to even close his eyes. He didn't want to go back, but he knew the house was waiting for someone else, someone who might not be as lucky as him. The next morning, he packed his things and left Westbrook without a second thought. He never spoke of what happened to anyone, not even to his closest friends. But every time he passed by the old mill, Icarus, eyes would linger on it, and he couldn't shake the feeling that the shadow was still watching, waiting for the next person to enter. Story 4. The Lonely Highway Hitchhiker. It was an unusually cold October night when Ben, a 27-year-old truck driver, found himself traveling along Route 9 in Northern California. He had been on the road for nearly 12 hours and had just left a rest stop after refueling. The sun had already set, and the thick fog that rolled in from the coast made visibility minimal. His headlights cut through the dense mist, casting eerie shadows that danced along the edge of the road. He had driven this route countless times, but tonight something felt off. An unsettling feeling crept into his gut, gnawing at him. The highway stretched for miles, cutting through dense forests and remote stretches of land. Ben wasn't exactly nervous, but he couldn't help but notice how empty the road felt. As the miles passed, the quietness seemed to grow louder in his ears, broken only by the hum of his truck's engine. Around 1:30 a.m., about 60 miles into his journey, Ben saw something unusual in his rearview mirror, a figure standing by the side of the road. It was a hitchhiker, something Ben didn't see often on this stretch of road. The fog was so thick that he almost couldn't make out the person's features, but he could tell they were wearing a long coat. Ben had seen enough hitchhikers in his day to recognize the gesture of the thumb pointing toward him. He had passed a rest stop just a few miles back, so he figured it was odd that someone would be out here, especially in such poor visibility. Ben wasn't one to stop for hitchhikers. His job didn't allow for the risk, but he felt a strange pull to this particular person. Maybe it was the eerie fog, or maybe it was the loneliness of the road, but he couldn't resist the urge to stop. Against his better judgment, Ben slowed down his truck, rolled down the passenger side window, and stopped just in front of the figure. "Need a ride?" Ben asked, his voice breaking the silence of the night. The figure didn't immediately respond. It was as if they were sizing him up, or maybe contemplating their next move. The person then stepped closer, still shrouded by the fog. Ben could just make out the face now, a young man, probably in his early 20s. His features were pale, almost ghostly, and his eyes were wide, staring intently at Ben. He was also drenched from head to toe, his coat clinging to his body as if he had been out in the rain for hours. Ben felt a chill run down his spine as the hitchhiker opened his mouth. But instead of the usual thank you or a simple yes, the man's words were more like a plea. "Are you going north?" the hitchhiker asked, his voice barely audible above the sound of the wind. "Yeah, I'm headed up to Sacramento," Ben replied, trying to keep his tone neutral. "Where are you headed?" The hitchhiker hesitated for a moment, glancing toward the thick mist that swallowed the road behind him. "I just need to get away from here," he said. "Can you take me past the next town? I've got a place I need to get to." Ben paused for a moment. Something about the hitchhiker's urgency felt off, but he didn't want to be rude, and the night had been so long that he could use the company, so he motioned for him to hop in. "All right, get in," Ben said, pushing the door open just slightly. The man nodded gratefully and climbed into the passenger seat. As soon as the door closed, the truck felt colder. The smell of damp clothes and something metallic filled the air, but Ben didn't say anything. He started driving again, the truck's headlights cutting through the fog, their yellow glow illuminating the long stretch of empty road ahead. For the first few minutes, the ride was eerily quiet, save for the occasional sound of the engine and the soft hum of the tires against the wet pavement. Ben tried to make small talk to ease the tension, but the hitchhiker remained mostly silent. The few words he spoke were curt and barely audible, as though he were lost in thought. "Have you been out here long?" Ben asked, glancing over at the man. The hitchhiker's eyes flicked toward him, but he didn't respond right away. When he did speak, it was in a hushed voice, almost like he didn't want to be heard. "I've been traveling for days," he said. I just need to get away from it all, from everyone. Ben nodded, unsure of what to make of the cryptic response. But before he could ask another question, the man's demeanor changed. He shifted in his seat, twisting his body to face the window, his hands clenched tightly on his lap. Ben's unease grew. He could feel the man's eyes still on him, even though it seemed like he was staring out into the fog. The silence stretched between them, and the road ahead appeared endless. Then, just as Ben was about to speak again, the hitchhiker suddenly turned toward him. His expression twisted in a way that made Ben's heart race. His eyes were wide, the whites visible all around his pupils. His mouth opened in a strange smile, half smirk, half grimace. "I know what you're thinking," the hitchhiker said, his voice low and dangerous. Ben's grip tightened on the steering wheel. "What do you mean?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. The hitchhiker leaned closer, his breath cold against Ben's neck. "You shouldn't have stopped for me, but now you're trapped." Ben's pulse quickened as he tried to make sense of the situation. Was this some sort of prank, or was the man just unstable? "What do you want from me?" Ben asked, his voice shaky. The hitchhiker's smile grew wider, almost predatory now. "You'll see soon enough." The air in the truck grew unbearably cold. The hairs on the back of Ben's neck stood on end, and his instincts screamed for him to pull over and let the man out. But as he looked out the window, he realized the road had changed. The scenery was unfamiliar. There were no more trees lining the highway, just an open, desolate plain. "Where are we?" Ben asked, his voice barely a whisper. The hitchhiker didn't answer. Instead, he simply stared out the window, his lips now silent, his eyes vacant once again. Ben felt a growing sense of dread, something he couldn't explain. Suddenly, the truck's headlights flickered and went out. The world around them was swallowed by darkness. Ben slammed on the brakes, but the truck didn't stop. It kept rolling forward, slower and slower, until the engine stalled completely. Ben's heart hammered in his chest as he tried to restart the truck, but it wouldn't turn over. He glanced at the hitchhiker, who was now staring straight ahead, his eyes wide open, unmoving. Ben's mind raced, and a deep sense of terror settled into his gut. The truck was now dead in the middle of the road, miles from civilization, with no way to get help. The hitchhiker turned to face Ben again, his face now twisted into a cruel grin. "This is where you get off." Ben didn't think twice. He threw open the door and ran, his legs trembling beneath him. Behind him, he could hear the hitchhiker laughing, his eerie voice echoing in the darkness. As Ben ran through the fog, his mind raced. He didn't know where he was or how he would get out, but he couldn't stay there any longer. He kept running, the sound of his breath ragged and desperate. Hours later, Ben stumbled into a small, rundown gas station. The attendant, an older man, looked at him like he had seen a ghost. "You shouldn't have stopped for him," the attendant said quietly, shaking his head. Ben's blood ran cold as he looked at the man. "What do you mean?" The attendant glanced over his shoulder, lowering his voice. "That hitchhiker? He's been haunting this road for years. No one who picks him up ever makes it out." Ben never spoke of that night again, but he knew one thing for sure. There are things that wait on the road, things that should never be picked up. Story 5. The Ghost of the Highway Rest. Sarah had been driving for hours, trying to make the long trip from New York City to Charleston, South Carolina. The highway stretched endlessly before her, the monotonous rhythm of the tires on the asphalt making her feel like she was slowly drifting into a trance. She was alone in her car, the hum of the engine and the occasional rustle of the trees along the road the only sounds accompanying her. The sun had long since disappeared, leaving only the faintest sliver of twilight hanging in. The sky and the headlights cast long shadows that danced across the road. She hadn't planned on stopping, but the fatigue from the long journey was beginning to weigh on her. Her eyes were growing heavy, and her back was aching from being hunched over the wheel for so long. The next rest stop was coming up on the GPS, and it looked like a good place to stretch her legs, grab a snack, and use the bathroom. The rest stop appeared as a small, dimly lit structure off the side of the highway. It wasn't particularly busy, just a few trucks parked around, their engines off for the night, their drivers nowhere to be seen. The harsh glow of the lights in the parking lot made the place look sterile and lifeless. Sarah's stomach turned slightly, but she pulled in anyway, deciding she needed the break. She parked near the entrance, grabbing her purse and stepping out of the car. The air was cool but still heavy with the scent of damp earth. The wind had picked up a little, making the surrounding trees sway slightly. She walked toward the building, glancing at her phone as she checked her messages. It wasn't until she reached the door that she realized how quiet the rest stop was. Too quiet. Even the trucks parked nearby were silent. The usual buzz of activity that came with these types of stops was absent. She felt a strange sensation in her chest, a discomfort she couldn't shake, but she told herself it was just the tiredness playing tricks on her. Inside, the rest stop was small and poorly lit, with only a couple of vending machines and a long counter at the back. No employees, no customers, just silence. She walked over to the bathroom area, finding it to be just as quiet and empty. As she washed her hands, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her. She turned around quickly, expecting to see someone standing there, but the space was empty. There was no one in sight. She couldn't explain it, but the air around her felt dense, almost suffocating, as if the entire place had a heaviness to it that didn't belong. As she exited the bathroom, she spotted an old, faded map of the highway system on the wall next to the door. It was strange. Sarah had never seen a rest stop with such an old map, especially one that seemed out of place. It had no digital touchscreen, no modern amenities. It looked like something that had been around for decades, gathering dust. She took a step closer, squinting at the worn-out edges of the paper, when something caught her eye. A faint, ghostly outline of a figure appeared in the corner of the map. Sarah blinked hard, thinking it was just a trick of the light. But when she looked again, the outline was still there, a shadow of a person standing beside the map. She froze, her heart racing in her chest. The shadow seemed to twitch, moving just slightly, but it was impossible to tell whether it was real or just a trick of her exhausted mind. Before she could turn away, she heard a noise, a soft sound, almost like a whisper. Her eyes shot toward the far corner of the room, where the vending machine stood. She thought she saw someone standing there, a tall figure in a long coat, their back turned toward her. It was a man, though his face was obscured by the darkness, and the figure didn't seem to move at all. She called out, her voice echoing in the empty space, but the man didn't respond. "Hello?" she said, her voice trembling. "Is anyone there?" The figure remained motionless. Suddenly, a cold gust of wind swept through the building, and the lights flickered. For a split second, Sarah's stomach dropped, and she felt the sharp pang of panic rise in her chest. The man's figure seemed to waver for just a moment, like a mirage, and then he vanished, gone. No trace of him was left behind. Shaking, Sarah turned to leave, her heart pounding in her ears. She glanced around one last time, hoping to see anyone else, anything that would make sense of the strange experience. But there was no one. She was completely alone. She hurried back to her car, looking over her shoulder constantly, half expecting to see the figure from the rest stop walking toward her in the parking lot. But the area was still and empty. The trucks remained parked, the drivers nowhere to be seen. Sarah quickly got into her car, locking the doors behind her. As she pulled out of the parking lot and back onto the highway, she glanced in her rearview mirror. For a moment, the road behind her seemed completely clear. But then she saw something in the distance, a shadow not from her headlights, but from something else. A tall, dark figure standing just off the side of the highway, watching her. She slammed her foot on the gas, her heart pounding harder than ever. The rest stop was now far behind her, but the image of that figure stayed with her. She tried to shake it off, telling herself it was just her mind playing tricks, but she couldn't help but wonder. Was the rest stop haunted? Was there something more sinister about that place than she had realized? She didn't know. But one thing was for certain, she never stopped at that rest stop again. Story 6. The Vanishing Car on Route 61. Chris had always been a road trip enthusiast. Whether it was for work or leisure, he loved driving long distances and listening to podcasts or music while the miles seemed to pass in a blur. On this particular night, he was making the long trek from New Orleans back to his home in Memphis. He had left the city late in the evening, hoping to make it back before dawn, But the fatigue of a long day caught up with him quicker than expected. It was just past midnight when he found himself cruising down the empty stretch of Route 61, a highway that wound through the desolate countryside of Mississippi. Chris had driven this route many times before, but tonight the road felt different. The air was thick with humidity, and the moon, full and bright, illuminated the highway like a spotlight. The road was empty, save for the occasional flicker of a farmhouse light in the distance. The further he drove, the more desolate the landscape seemed. Trees lined the road, their branches twisted and reaching like dark arms, and the occasional rundown shack appeared at the edge of the highway. There was something eerie about the place, something that made his usual calmness begin to crack. He couldn't pinpoint it, but he had the nagging feeling that something wasn't quite right. About an hour into his drive, the radio signal began to fade. Chris reached down to adjust the dial, trying to find something to distract him from the growing unease that lingered in the back of his mind. That's when he saw it, headlights in the distance. A car, driving at a decent speed, was heading straight toward him. He squinted into the darkness, trying to make out the vehicle, but it was too far off. Chris wasn't in a hurry, so he decided to slow down a bit, letting the other car pass him. It was a strange feeling, like his mind was telling him that the vehicle might be important, or maybe it was just a coincidence. The headlights grew closer, and as they came into view, Chris saw the silhouette of a car, a dark sedan, racing down the road at an alarmingly fast speed. The other car didn't appear to slow down at all, and it seemed to be veering slightly into Chris's lane, almost as if it didn't see him. Chris's grip tightened on the steering wheel, and he swerved to the right to avoid a collision. The car zoomed past him, so close that he could feel the rush of wind against his truck. His heart was racing, and his adrenaline shot up as he watched the sedan in his rearview mirror. But as he looked, the car, though still speeding ahead, seemed to fade into the night. Its lights dimmed, its shape becoming more indistinct, as if it was disappearing into thin air. Did that really just happen? Chris muttered to himself, confused by the bizarre encounter. He looked around but couldn't spot the car anywhere behind him. There was no trace of it, no tail lights flickering. He glanced at the rearview mirror again. Nothing. The highway stretched on, as empty as it had been before. Shaking his head, he turned his attention back to the road ahead, trying to push the unsettling feeling out of his mind. He didn't want to admit it, but he couldn't shake the thought that something had been wrong with that car. The way it had moved, the way it seemed to almost vanish, it didn't make sense. For the next several miles, Chris tried to focus on the road, occasionally glancing in the rearview mirror to make sure no other cars were on his tail. The empty highway, however, remained unchanged. Not a single car passed by him for what felt like an eternity. The only thing he could hear now was the steady hum of his truck's engine and the occasional rustling of the wind outside. But then, just as he was beginning to calm down, a strange noise broke the silence. An odd scraping sound, like something dragging across the road. Chris furrowed his brow, looking around. He didn't see anything out of place, but the noise persisted. It was coming from somewhere ahead of him. It sounded like a car. No, a truck, its tires scraping against something on the asphalt. He slammed his foot down on the gas, eager to get past whatever was blocking the road. But the sound only grew louder, more frantic. The scraping was joined by a low, droning hum, and Chris's heart skipped a beat. He could barely see ahead. Of him now, the headlights of his truck revealing only the faintest outline of something up ahead. Then he saw it. The dark sedan, the same one that had passed him earlier, was stopped in the middle of the highway, its engine still running, but its headlights completely off. The car was facing the wrong way, as if it had turned around and come back to block his path. The faint sound of a dragging noise continued as Chris's truck grew closer. He had to stop. He slammed on the brakes, coming to a screeching halt a few feet away from the sedan. His hands were trembling as he gripped the wheel, the sudden fear coursing through him. The sedan's taillights flickered faintly in the distance, but the car was completely silent now. Chris hesitated. Should he get out and investigate? He didn't want to, but curiosity gnawed at him. He thought about the noise, scraping, dragging, almost like someone was walking around outside the car. The thought sent a cold chill through his body. He was beginning to feel like he wasn't alone anymore. "Hello?" Chris called out, his voice barely a whisper. He had no idea why he did it, but something in him urged him to speak. He waited, but there was no response. The world felt too still, too quiet. After a few seconds, Chris decided to try and drive around the car. He shifted into drive, trying to edge around it. But as he did, something caught his eye. Someone standing by the side of the road. A figure, dark and almost indistinct in the fog, was watching him intently. His stomach dropped. It was the same man, the same figure he had seen earlier in the rearview mirror. But this time, he wasn't in a car. He was standing by the road watching Chris. His face was pale, almost ghostly, and his eyes, those dark, hollow eyes, seemed to stare straight into Chris's soul. In a panic, Chris slammed his foot on the gas, flooring the pedal as his truck lurched forward. The sedan behind him seemed to fade into the background, and the figure disappeared from view. The highway ahead of him was empty again, but now Chris didn't care. His mind was racing, his breath shallow. He didn't know if what he had just experienced was real, if he had imagined it all, or if it was some twisted nightmare. He glanced back once more in the rearview mirror. Nothing. The rest of the journey to Memphis passed in silence. Chris didn't stop for anything. He didn't even glance out the window. He simply focused on getting to his destination, his heart still racing. But he would never forget the figure on Route 61. The ghostly hitchhiker who seemed to follow him, appearing and disappearing like a mirage. A part of him knew that he would never drive that highway again. Story 7. The Silent Hitchhiker on Route 13. It was an unusually quiet night as Brian made his way down Route 13 in Delaware. He had been driving for hours, heading south for a family gathering in Virginia. It was late, well past midnight, and the moon hung low in the sky, casting an eerie glow on the road ahead. Brian had driven this route many times before, so he knew it well, though tonight, something felt off. The headlights of his car illuminated the empty stretch of road, and the only noise was the steady hum of the engine and the occasional flicker of the turn signals. The trees along the road seemed to loom like dark shadows, their branches swaying in the night air. As much as Brian tried to shake off the unsettling feeling, it persisted. Maybe it was just fatigue or the strange quiet of the road, but something about tonight felt different. He had been driving for hours without seeing another car, and that was beginning to feel a little too strange. There were no other headlights, no signs of life in the small towns and villages he passed through. Just the endless, desolate road that seemed to stretch on forever. Then, as if from nowhere, he saw a figure. Up ahead on the shoulder of the road stood a man. It was an odd place to be, especially at this hour. The man was tall, dressed in a dark coat and a hoodie, and standing motionless by the side of the highway. The strange part was that he wasn't waving or trying to flag Brian down. He was simply standing there, staring at the car as it approached. Brian's grip tightened on the wheel, and he slowed his speed, not sure why, but feeling a growing sense of discomfort. As he drew closer to the figure, he could see that the man's face was obscured by the hood, but his posture seemed unnatural, rigid and still, as if he had been standing there for a long time. There was something haunting about the way he stood there in the dark, not moving at all. Brian couldn't tell why, but something told him to stop. Maybe the man needed help, or maybe it was his natural inclination to help someone stranded on the side of the road. But as he approached, he decided to keep driving, telling himself that it was better not to stop in the middle of nowhere, especially at night. Yet as his car passed by the figure, Brian couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. He glanced in his rearview mirror, and that's when his heart skipped a beat. The man was following him. Brian blinked in disbelief. He had been sure the man was standing still, not moving a muscle when he passed by. But now there he was, walking briskly, keeping pace with Brian's car. It was as if he was keeping up, step for step, matching the car's speed as it traveled down the road. But that wasn't all. The figure wasn't walking on the shoulder anymore. He was right on the edge of the asphalt, his legs moving unnaturally fast, his head still hanging low under the hood. Brian's stomach tightened. He wasn't sure why, but the man's movement seemed impossible. No one could keep up with a car on foot like that. especially not on the open highway, where there were no sidewalks, no safety barriers, just miles of road ahead. Brian's mind raced with questions, but he couldn't bring himself to stop and investigate. It didn't feel right. The feeling of being watched was unbearable now, so much so that he felt the need to get away from the strange figure as quickly as possible. He stepped on the gas, accelerating to try to put distance between himself and the man. But as he sped up, he noticed something even stranger. In his rearview mirror, the man was still there. Only now, he was moving faster, almost as though he was running, closing the gap. His steps were heavy and hurried, and yet his body remained unnervingly still. Didn't sway with the movement of running. It was as if the figure was gliding over the pavement, faster than should have been possible. Brian's pulse quickened, his breath coming in short gasps. His hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. He had to get away. The road ahead seemed endless, and the headlights barely illuminated the dark expanse. After several miles, Brian checked his mirror again. The man had stopped running, but he was still standing there, by the side of the road. His face was now completely visible in the glow of the headlights, and that's when Brian saw it. The man's face was pale, almost sickly, with hollow eyes that glowed faintly in the dark. His skin was stretched tight over his skull, and his lips were curled into a thin, unnatural smile. It was the smile of someone who knew something Brian didn't, something that didn't belong in this world. For a moment, Brian's heart stopped. His entire body went cold as he stared back at the figure in the mirror. The man's eyes locked with his, and the smile never wavered. A shiver ran down Brian's spine as he realized something he hadn't thought of before. The man hadn't been running. He had been keeping up with the car without moving a muscle. As impossible as it seemed, the figure wasn't bound by the laws of physics, not anymore. And that thought terrified Brian more than he could ever put into words. Suddenly, the car in front of him, a large truck, slammed on its brakes. Brian reacted just in time, swerving to avoid a collision. The car jerked to the right, narrowly missing the truck, and he heard the screech of tires as the vehicle came to a stop. His heart was racing, and he slammed on the brakes, coming to a halt just in time. Shaking, Brian looked up, but the road was empty. The truck had vanished, and the figure from before was gone as well. There was nothing but the highway stretching ahead, an endless stretch of darkness and empty asphalt. He was left there, his mind spinning, the echo of his breath heavy in his ears. Had the man been real, or had it all been a trick of the mind, a hallucination brought on by exhaustion? Brian didn't know. What he did know was that he didn't feel safe anymore. The rest of the drive passed in a blur of caution and paranoia, his eyes darting between the rear-view mirror and the empty road ahead. By the time he reached his destination, the sun had just begun to rise. But he couldn't shake the feeling that someone had followed him all the way from that desolate stretch of Route 13. And to this day, Brian never drives alone on that highway at night. Story 8, The Stranger in the Rearview Mirror. Jessica had been on the road for what seemed like an eternity. She had spent the last 10 years of her life living in various cities around California, working in tech, and constantly bouncing between projects. It wasn't ideal, but it paid the bills. So, when her latest contract finished in Los Angeles, she decided to take a long drive up Highway 5, heading towards San Francisco. The long drive was the perfect opportunity for some much-needed peace and solitude, or so she thought. It was a late summer evening when Jessica began her journey. The sun was beginning to set, casting the California landscape in a golden hue. The road stretched out ahead, mostly empty, save for a few long-haul trucks that seemed to appear and disappear along the horizon. She rolled the windows down, letting the warm, dry air rush in as she cruised along, the faint hum of her car's engine filling the otherwise quiet space. The drive should have been peaceful, but the further Jessica went, the more she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It wasn't the stretch of highway she had taken many times before, but it had been a while since she had driven this way at night. As the evening settled into night, the lights on the highway became fewer and further between, and the silence seemed to grow more intense. Jessica tried to push the strange feeling out of her mind. After all, she had driven alone countless times, and nothing had ever happened. The rhythmic sound of the tires on the road started to lull her into a daze, and she glanced at the dashboard clock. It was nearly 10 p.m. The road was dark now, illuminated only by her headlights. It wasn't long before she realized that the few trucks she had passed earlier were no longer around. She was alone. It was about 45 minutes into the drive when it happened. Jessica had been mindlessly staring out the windshield when, out of the corner of her eye, she noticed a car in her rearview mirror. It was a dark sedan, unusually close to her bumper. She didn't think much of it at first. She figured it was just another driver who didn't respect the space between them. She accelerated slightly to give herself some distance, but the car behind her matched her speed. No matter how fast she drove, the sedan stayed right behind her, almost as though it was glued to her tail. Unease crept into her chest and she glanced at the mirror again. The sedan's headlights shone bright in the rear view, illuminating the darkness behind her. It was strange. The other car seemed to move at the exact same speed, never gaining on her or falling back. She could make out the vague silhouette of the car, but the headlights made it impossible to see the driver. She slowed down slightly, hoping the car would pass, but it didn't. It just stayed, there, following her. Jessica felt the knot of anxiety tighten in her stomach. Something about it didn't feel right. She had driven for hours before, but she had never felt so intensely followed. Her heart began to race, and the once peaceful drive was now an uncomfortable experience. She glanced at the clock again. It was 10:30 now, and there was no sign of any other cars on the road. The sedan was the only one behind her, and its headlights never wavered. Trying to stay calm, Jessica decided to pull off the road to a gas station a few miles ahead, hoping to lose the car in the parking lot or stop for a break. But as she signaled to exit, something strange happened. The sedan, still glued to her rear view, followed her off the highway, making the same turn as she did, as if it knew exactly where she was going. Her pulse quickened and her anxiety grew. She pulled into the dimly lit gas station, the sedan following right behind her. Jessica parked at one of the pumps, her hands trembling, as she put the car in park. The sedan pulled up behind her, but the headlights went dark, leaving the area eerily quiet. For a few moments, everything was still. Jessica didn't know what to do. Was she imagining things? Was it just some other driver, tired of the long road? She sat frozen in her car for a moment, staring at the dark sedan through her rearview mirror. After what felt like an eternity, the sound of a car door opening broke the silence. Jessica's heart raced and her body stiffened as she saw a figure moving towards her. It was a man. He was tall, wearing a dark jacket and a baseball cap, but his face was obscured by the dim light from the station. Jessica's breath hitched, and she quickly locked her doors. She had no idea why, but she couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't a coincidence. The man was walking toward her car slowly, purposefully, his footsteps deliberate. It didn't help that she couldn't see his face. His body language sent a chill down her spine. The last thing she wanted to do was confront him. Without thinking, she quickly started the car again, preparing to drive off. But before she could put the car in gear, the man reached her window. He tapped lightly on the glass, startling her. She jumped back, her heart pounding in her chest. The man stood outside for a moment, and then he mouthed something. Jessica couldn't hear him, but his lips were moving. She stared at him, unsure of what to do. Was he asking for help? Or was this some strange situation where he had been following her for a reason? Fear flooded her body. Jessica wasn't a coward, but something about this felt wrong. Her instincts screamed at her to leave. She turned the key in the ignition and slammed her foot on the gas pedal, driving away from the gas station without looking back. She didn't even check her mirror. She was too afraid to. For the next few miles, Jessica drove at top speed, weaving through the deserted highway, trying to put as much distance between herself and that creepy encounter. She glanced at the rearview mirror once or twice, expecting to see the dark sedan tailing her again, but there was nothing. The road behind her was empty. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The man had said nothing, only mouthed words she couldn't hear. But it didn't matter. He was still out there, somewhere. Jessica eventually made it to her destination, but the image of that man and his silent approach stayed with her. To this Day, she wonders if the car and the man were real, or if they were part of a bizarre hallucination from the exhaustion of the long drive. But the fear that washed over her that night was undeniable.